You're walking through the opulent corridors of Windsor Castle in the year 1811, and you stumble upon a door that's been sealed shut for over 4 decades. Behind that door lies a secret so devastating, so carefully hidden from history books, that even today, most people have never heard the name of the boy who disappeared behind it. But whispers follow in the corridors because everyone who served the royal household knew the horrifying truth, that somewhere within these walls lived a prince who had been erased from existence, and what his own father did to him represents one of the most disturbing acts of royal cruelty ever documented. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these buried stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of royal excess or political intrigue. It's the story of how absolute power can transform parental love into obsessive control, how royal duty can become a prison more brutal than any dungeon, and how a human being can be systematically destroyed not by enemies, but by the very person who brought them into this world. The name Prince Octavius might not appear in your history textbooks, but his story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the man who would become the architect of this tragedy, King George III. He wasn't born a monster. In fact, his early relationship with his children showed remarkable tenderness for a monarch of his era. When George ascended to the throne in 1760, many subjects believed they were witnessing the dawn of a more compassionate royal house. He was devoted to his wife, Queen Charlotte, took genuine interest in his children's education, and even played with them in ways that scandalized the rigid court protocol of the time. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most loving souls, and by 1780, something had fundamentally shifted inside the king's mind. Maybe it was the constant pressure of ruling an empire in crisis, with American colonies in revolt and European powers circling like vultures. Maybe it was the isolation that comes with being the only person in a kingdom who could never be contradicted, challenged, or told they were wrong. Or maybe it was what had happened to his firstborn son, the future George IV, whose rebellious behavior had become a source of public embarrassment that threatened the very foundations of royal authority. Prince Octavius was born in February 1779, the 13th child of King George and Queen Charlotte. Unlike his older brothers who had already begun displaying the wild, ungovernable tendencies that would later make them the scandal of European courts, Octavius emerged as everything a royal parent could hope for. He was intelligent beyond his years, naturally obedient, and possessed a gentle disposition that seemed to embody all the virtues his father desperately wanted to see in the royal bloodline. Contemporary accounts describe young Octavius as almost angelic in appearance and temperament. Court painters competed for the privilege of capturing his likeness, creating portraits that showed a boy with golden curls, bright blue eyes, and an expression of such innocent nobility that even hardened courtiers would soften in his presence. Palace servants reported that the prince had never been heard to raise his voice in anger, never struck another child, and showed remarkable compassion for those of lower station. But it was precisely these virtues that would seal Octavius's fate. King George, watching his older sons careen from scandal to scandal, began to see in his youngest boy not just a beloved child, but a living symbol of what royal blood could achieve under proper guidance. The king's affection for Octavius gradually transformed into something far more dangerous, an obsession with perfection that would consume both father and son. The first signs of trouble appeared when Octavius turned 5. While his brothers were sent to separate establishments with their own tutors and households, the king insisted that his youngest remain under direct royal supervision. This wasn't unusual in itself, but George's involvement in the boy's education went far beyond normal paternal interest. The king personally selected every tutor, approved every lesson plan, and demanded daily reports on his son's progress in subjects ranging from Latin and mathematics to deportment and religious instruction. What started as devoted parenting slowly evolved into suffocating control. The king began restricting Octavius's contact with his siblings, convinced that their corrupting influence would taint his perfect child. Palace records show that by 1785, the prince was no longer permitted to dine with the royal family, instead taking his meals in private chambers under the watchful eyes of specially selected servants who reported his every word back to the king. The isolation deepened when George decided that traditional royal education wasn't sufficient for his special son. The king had become convinced that Octavius possessed extraordinary intellectual gifts that required extraordinary measures to protect and cultivate. He commissioned the construction of private apartments within Windsor Castle, designed specifically to serve as both classroom and sanctuary for the young prince. These apartments, hidden away in the castle's east wing, were marvels of royal excess disguised as educational necessity. The rooms were filled with the finest books, scientific instruments, and artistic materials that money could procure. Maps covered the walls, globes stood in every corner, and cabinets displayed collections of minerals, pressed flowers, and exotic specimens from across the empire. To outside observers, it might have looked like a paradise designed for learning, but paradise can become a prison when you're not allowed to leave. Court records from this period, discovered centuries later in sealed royal archives, reveal the systematic nature of Octavius's confinement. The prince was placed on a rigid schedule that accounted for every minute of his day, from his morning prayers at 6 o'clock to his evening studies that often extended past midnight. He was tutored in languages, sciences, arts, and philosophy by scholars recruited from the finest universities in Europe, but always in complete isolation from other children his age. The king justified this extreme approach as necessary preparation for the extraordinary destiny he envisioned for his son. In private letters to Queen Charlotte, George wrote of his plans to make Octavius not just a prince, but the perfect embodiment of enlightened monarchy. He believed that by controlling every aspect of the boy's development, he could create a ruler who would surpass even the greatest monarchs of history. What the king failed to understand was that he was systematically destroying the very humanity he claimed to be perfecting. Cut off from normal childhood experiences, friendships, and even basic human contact outside his carefully selected tutors and servants, Octavius began to change in ways that should have alarmed his father, but instead seemed to reinforce George's belief in his methods. The boy became unnaturally compliant, responding to instructions with mechanical precision that impressed his tutors but revealed a spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of impossible expectations. Palace servants noted that the prince rarely smiled anymore, spoke only when directly addressed, and had developed nervous habits like constantly adjusting his clothing and checking over his shoulder as if expecting to be watched, because he was always being watched. The king's surveillance of his son extended to every conceivable detail of the prince's existence. Hidden panels were installed in the walls of Octavius's chambers, allowing George to observe his child's behavior when the boy believed himself alone. Court craftsmen, sworn to absolute secrecy, created ingenious viewing devices disguised as decorative elements throughout the apartments. What appeared to be ornate mirrors were actually two-way glass, elaborate tapestries concealed spy holes, and even the prince's writing desk was designed with hidden compartments where servants could retrieve samples of his private thoughts. The psychological impact on young Octavius was devastating. By his 8th birthday, palace physicians were documenting concerning changes in the prince's behavior and physical health. He had developed what they termed nervous tremors, sudden episodes where his hands would shake uncontrollably during lessons. His appetite diminished to the point where servants had to coax him to eat even his favorite foods. Most troubling of all, the boy began talking to himself in whispers, carrying on elaborate conversations with imaginary companions who seemed more real to him than the flesh and blood people around him. But rather than recognizing these symptoms as cries for help from a child whose spirit was being systematically broken, King George interpreted them as evidence that his methods were working. The tremors, he believed, showed sensitivity and refinement. The loss of appetite demonstrated proper aristocratic restraint. The whispered conversations revealed an active intellect engaged in sophisticated internal dialogue. The king's delusions about his son's condition were reinforced by the carefully curated reports he received from Octavius's tutors and caregivers. These individuals, completely dependent on royal favor for their positions and terrified of contradicting the increasingly unstable monarch, provided only the information they believed George wanted to hear. They described a young prince of extraordinary learning, remarkable composure, and angelic disposition, carefully omitting any details that might suggest psychological distress or emotional damage. One particularly chilling account found in the private diary of a palace physician who served during this period describes an incident that occurred when Octavius was 9 years old. The prince had been discovered in his chambers at 3 in the morning, standing perfectly still in the center of the room, staring at his reflection in one of the hidden mirrors. When questioned by servants, the boy explained that he was practicing being watched because he needed to make sure he looked proper even when he thought he was alone. The physician noted that this behavior suggested the child had become aware of the constant surveillance and was adapting to it in ways that were both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. Octavius wasn't just being observed, he was learning to observe himself, internalizing his father's controlling gaze until it became part of his own consciousness. As the prince entered his 10th year, King George decided that traditional academic instruction was no longer sufficient for his perfect child. The king had become convinced that Octavius possessed not just intellectual gifts, but supernatural qualities that required spiritual cultivation. He began consulting with mystics, theologians, and practitioners of esoteric arts, who promised to unlock the divine potential they claimed to see in the young prince. These consultations led to increasingly bizarre modifications to Octavius's daily routine. The boy was subjected to elaborate purification rituals that involved special baths prepared with exotic oils and minerals, dietary restrictions based on astrological calculations, and meditation practices borrowed from Eastern philosophies that had recently captured the imagination of certain European intellectuals. Palace records show purchases of rare incense, ceremonial robes, and books on subjects ranging from alchemy to ancient Egyptian mysteries. The prince's apartments were transformed into something resembling a temple, more than a classroom. Symbols and diagrams were painted on the walls, according to instructions provided by the king's mystical advisors. Candlelit ceremonies were conducted at specific hours determined by lunar cycles and planetary alignments. Octavius was required to participate in these rituals with the same mechanical compliance he had learned to apply to his academic studies, though servants noted that the boy's nervous tremors became more pronounced during these sessions. The story of Prince Octavius serves as a haunting reminder that the greatest monsters in history aren't always foreign enemies or political rivals, but sometimes the very people who claim to love us most. His tragic fate, sealed away behind palace walls and buried beneath centuries of royal secrecy, shows us how absolute power can corrupt even the purest intentions, transforming parental devotion into psychological torture. Perhaps most chilling of all is how this young boy's suffering was justified as love, his imprisonment disguised as protection, and his destruction presented as perfection. The next time you walk past any seat of power, remember Prince Octavius, and ask yourself what other secrets might be hidden behind those walls.